After Pearl Harbor, America had been shocked. After Midway, it had hope. But on Guadalcanal, hope had to survive. It had to survive mud, hunger, malaria, exhaustion, jungle darkness, and some of the fiercest naval fighting of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal was not a single dramatic morning like Pearl Harbor. It was not a short, decisive clash like Midway. It was a 6-month struggle fought across beaches, jungles, airstrips, and black water at night. It was a campaign where a half-finished airfield became the center of an entire war, where Marines landed thinking they were beginning an offensive, then discovered they were also beginning an endurance test, where destroyers raced in under darkness, where aircraft fought for daylight control, and where men on both sides learned that survival could be as hard as victory. Guadalcanal matters because it was the moment the United States proved it could do more than absorb blows and strike back once. It proved it could seize ground, hold it under pressure, and win a prolonged campaign against a determined enemy. By the time Guadalcanal was over, Japan had not merely lost an island. It had lost momentum. And in the Pacific, momentum was everything. This is the story of how Guadalcanal changed the Pacific War. To understand Guadalcanal, you have to understand geography. The island itself was not famous. It was not a great capital, a major fortress, or a political symbol. But in war, geography does not need fame to become destiny. In July 1942, Japanese troops and laborers moved on to Guadalcanal and began building an airfield. That single project changed the meaning of the island. If Japan completed the airfield and operated land-based aircraft from it, Allied communications and supply routes between the United States and Australia would come under growing threat. Bases across the South Pacific would become more vulnerable. The strategic map would tilt further in Japan's favor. That is why Guadalcanal mattered. The United States and its allies could not simply ignore the island and hope the danger would pass. The Japanese position there was not a distant inconvenience. It was the beginning of a problem that would grow stronger with every passing week. So the island became the target of Operation Watchtower, the first major American offensive in the Pacific War. That fact alone makes Guadalcanal historic. This was not just another battle in a chain of Pacific engagements. It was the point at which the United States stopped reacting and began acting. It was the point at which strategic necessity became offensive action. And like many offensives launched under pressure, it would begin with urgency, imperfect preparation, and enormous risk. On August 7, 1942, the offensive began. American forces landed on Guadalcanal and nearby islands in the Southern Solomons. For the U.S. Marine Corps, this was a huge step into a new kind of war. Amphibious assault, jungle warfare, and sustained island fighting would all come together here. The landings were not the same everywhere. On Guadalcanal itself, the Marines met relatively light resistance at first. Japanese defenders had not expected such a sudden landing, and the Americans moved inland fast enough to seize their main objective, the unfinished airfield near Lunga Point. That airfield would soon be renamed Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. The name mattered, but the runway mattered more. From the moment it was taken, Henderson Field became the heart of the campaign. Every major decision from that point forward would be shaped by one question: who controls the airfield? Elsewhere, the fight was harder. At Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, Japanese defenders fought with far more stubbornness. Elite naval landing forces resisted fiercely, and the Americans discovered almost immediately that the campaign would not be won by surprise alone. Still, in the first phase, the offensive looked promising. The Americans had landed, they had seized the airfield, and for the first time in the Pacific War, the United States was clearly on the offensive. But first landings can be deceptive. They create headlines. They do not guarantee security. Because as the Marines dug in around Henderson Field, the Japanese were already moving to answer. If the landing phase suggested opportunity, the Battle of Savo Island delivered a warning. Just before 2 in the morning on August 9th, Japanese cruisers and destroyers struck the Allied naval force supporting the landings. What followed was one of the most painful early defeats the U.S. Navy suffered in the Pacific. The Japanese were fast, aggressive, and devastatingly effective in night action. In roughly half an hour, Allied cruisers were hit hard. 3 American cruisers, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, were sunk. The Australian cruiser Canberra was crippled. The scale and speed of the disaster shocked the Allied command. This mattered for more than morale. It deepened the vulnerability of the forces ashore. The Marines on Guadalcanal were still establishing themselves, still organizing supplies, still uncertain of what scale of Japanese response was coming. Now the naval shield around them looked far weaker than anyone wanted. Savo Island became an early lesson in one of Guadalcanal's central truths. Even when the United States held the airfield or the beachhead, it could still be badly hurt at sea. The waters north of Guadalcanal would see more and more ships destroyed over the months ahead. So many, in fact, that Allied sailors would come to call that stretch of water Iron Bottom Sound. That name tells you almost everything about the campaign. Guadalcanal was not just a land battle. It was an island campaign fed, defended, and punished by warships moving through dangerous water at all hours. And at Savo Island, the campaign's naval brutality announced itself early. After the landings and the shock of Savo Island, the campaign settled into its central struggle. Henderson Field had to be held. The airfield was incomplete, vulnerable, and constantly threatened. But once American aircraft began operating from it, Guadalcanal changed. The Allies gave the island the code name Cactus, and the mixed force of aviators who flew from Henderson became known as the Cactus Air Force. They came from different services and different backgrounds, but the mission was simple: keep the sky contested, attack Japanese shipping, and protect the fragile American foothold. In daylight, Henderson Field gave the Americans a weapon that shaped everything around the island. Japanese transport runs became more dangerous. Warships moving too close by day risked attack. The island was no longer just a patch of jungle held by Marines. It was a base projecting air power into the surrounding sea. That made Henderson Field a prize Japan had to destroy, and the Americans had to defend at almost any cost. The runway itself became a symbol of stubborn resistance. It was shelled, bombed, soaked in mud, and defended under constant strain. Yet it kept functioning. And as long as it kept functioning, the Americans had a fighting chance. This is why Guadalcanal cannot be understood as a sequence of unrelated clashes. Again and again, the campaign turned back toward Henderson Field. Whoever controlled that strip of land controlled the tempo of daylight war around Guadalcanal. And in a campaign ruled by supply, timing, and attrition, tempo meant survival. The first major Japanese ground attempt to retake Guadalcanal came at Tenaru. Japanese commanders had underestimated the American presence on the island. They did not yet grasp how strongly the Marines were dug in around Henderson Field. That miscalculation would prove fatal. In the pre-dawn hours of August 21st, Japanese troops attacked east of the American perimeter. They came forward with aggression and determination, expecting to rupture the Marine line and open the way to the airfield. Instead, they ran into concentrated American defense. The battle became savage and one-sided. Machine gun fire, artillery, and counterattacks tore apart the Japanese assault force. By the time it was over, the attacking unit had been effectively annihilated. Tenaru mattered for several reasons. First, it showed that Japan could not simply brush the Americans off Guadalcanal with small, aggressive attacks. Second, it gave the Marines proof that they could hold their ground against determined Japanese infantry. And third, it set the tone for the land campaign to come. Guadalcanal would not be won by elegant maneuver. It would be won by men holding narrow perimeters in darkness, mud, and exhaustion, then surviving the next attack. Tenaru also revealed something else. The fighting on Guadalcanal was going to be intensely personal. Close-range battle, little sleep, little comfort. A growing sense that the jungle itself was joining the fight. The island was becoming a place where offensive plans quickly turned into brutal tests of endurance. If Henderson Field controlled the day, the Japanese tried to control the night. That effort became known to the Allies as the Tokyo Express. Using fast destroyers, the Japanese sent troops and supplies down the slot under cover of darkness. These runs were dangerous but necessary. Daylight transport operations were too exposed to air attack from Henderson Field, so night became the only practical window. The Tokyo Express was both impressive and limited. It allowed Japan to reinforce Guadalcanal repeatedly. Troops could be moved in fast, urgency could be maintained, pressure on the American perimeter could continue. But destroyers were not cargo ships. They could not carry heavy loads efficiently. They could bring men, they could bring some supplies. They could not easily solve the full logistical demands of a prolonged campaign. That imbalance became one of the defining facts of Guadalcanal. The Americans struggled too. They suffered shortages, sickness, fatigue, and fear. But over time, the logistics equation began leaning their way. The Japanese could reach Guadalcanal. They increasingly could not sustain Guadalcanal. This turned the campaign into a war of nourishment as much as a war of bullets. Who got food? Who got ammunition? Who got replacements? Who got air support in daylight? And who was reduced to risky dashes in darkness? On Guadalcanal, logistics were not background details. They were combat power in another form. By September, the Japanese understood more clearly what Henderson Field meant. They also understood that small attacks would not be enough. To retake the airfield, they needed a stronger push against the American perimeter. That push came at Edson's Ridge. On the nights of September 13th and 14th, Colonel Merritt Edson's raiders and attached Marine troops held a ridge south of Henderson Field against repeated Japanese assaults. The attackers came in with determination and superior numbers. The defenders were thin, tired, and under tremendous pressure. This was not a battle of sweeping movement. It was a battle of holding on. The ridge became a place of darkness, noise, shouting, muzzle flashes, and lines that bent almost to the point of collapse. Japanese troops pressed forward again and again. American defenders gave ground, reformed, and held. The reason this battle matters so much is simple. If Henderson Field had fallen here, the entire campaign could have shifted. American air power would have been crippled. The Japanese would have gained room to strengthen their hold on the island, and the offensive momentum of the United States might have been cut short, just as it was beginning. But the ridge held. Edson's defense became one of the most famous Marine actions of the campaign, and with good reason. It showed that Guadalcanal would not be decided by one landing or one airstrike. It would be decided by repeated moments when exhausted men refused to let a vital position go. Guadalcanal was never just the island. It was also the sea around it. As both sides tried to feed the campaign, the wider Solomon Islands became a battlefield of carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft. These clashes did not always deliver clean, immediate results, but together they shaped who could keep fighting for Guadalcanal. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August, the Japanese failed to deliver support as effectively as they hoped. The light carrier Ryujo was lost, and although Enterprise was damaged, the Japanese did not gain the clean strategic result they needed. Then came Cape Esperance in October. Again, the waters near Guadalcanal produced another sharp and dangerous naval encounter. Again, the issue was the same: move strength toward the island, protect it, or stop the other side from doing so. At Santa Cruz later that month, Japan won something closer to a tactical success. The Americans lost Hornet, and Enterprise was again damaged. On paper, that looked impressive, but Santa Cruz also cost Japan experienced aviators it could not easily replace. This is one of the most important ideas in the entire campaign. Guadalcanal was consuming not just ships, but expertise, pilots, deck crews, commanders, logistical confidence, the ability to absorb loss and keep functioning. That matters because wars are not won simply by counting ships sunk on one day. They are won by asking which side can keep replacing loss, keep coordinating operations, and keep sustaining pressure over time. By that measure, Guadalcanal was becoming more dangerous for Japan with each passing month. By October, the campaign had reached a deeper level of intensity. Japanese strength on Guadalcanal had grown dramatically. More troops had come in, more effort had been committed. The contest for Henderson Field was no longer a matter of probing attacks and localized pressure. It was a full struggle for control of the island's center. The hardest land fighting came in late October. On October 24th and 25th, Japanese forces launched major assaults against the American perimeter. At one critical point, only a single Marine battalion stood between Henderson Field and a possible breakthrough. Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller's men fought under tremendous pressure. Again and again, Japanese troops charged. Again and again, the defenders held. Reinforcements from the 164th Infantry Regiment, the first U.S. Army unit to arrive on Guadalcanal, helped stabilize the line. Artillery, machine guns, discipline, and sheer stubbornness did the rest. The battle became one of those moments where a campaign feels as if it is narrowing into a single night, a single line, a single refusal to break. And once again, Henderson Field survived. This is why Guadalcanal must be seen as a cumulative struggle. The Americans did not win because one battle was easy. They won because each time the Japanese came close, the perimeter held long enough for the larger balance to move. The island was still brutal. The campaign was still uncertain. But by late October, the Japanese were paying heavily for every attempt to retake the field and still failing to seize it. By November, Guadalcanal had become a campaign both sides understood they could not simply abandon. The Japanese still hoped to smash Henderson Field and restore control. The Americans knew that if they held, the campaign could tip decisively in their favor. That is why the naval battle of Guadalcanal matters so much. In mid-November, Japanese forces made one of their last great efforts to break the American position. What followed was a series of savage night engagements in waters already crowded with wrecks and memory. Just after midnight on November 13th, American and Japanese surface forces collided in close-range darkness. The result was confusion, courage, terrible losses, and violence at point-blank range. The Japanese battleship Hiei was ultimately lost. The Americans lost cruisers, destroyers, and two rear admirals, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott. But the fighting did not end there. On November 14th and the night that followed, more combat erupted. Japanese warships shelled Henderson Field. Japanese transport efforts continued. American forces answered with battleships Washington and South Dakota. In the darkness, Washington found and battered Kirishima. Another major Japanese attempt to impose itself on the campaign was breaking apart. This is the point at which Guadalcanal began to feel irreversible. Not because the fighting stopped, it did not, but because the Japanese hope of delivering a decisive knockout blow against Henderson Field was collapsing. The campaign had started with the Americans taking a runway and trying to survive. By November, they were surviving and denying Japan its final great chance. After the November battles, the campaign did not end immediately, but its direction became much harder to miss. The Americans were now reinforcing Guadalcanal more effectively than the Japanese. Their position, though still difficult, was becoming stronger. The Japanese position, though still dangerous, was becoming less sustainable. In December, the 1st Marine Division, after 4 months of immense hardship, began to be relieved by Army units. The struggle continued into the new year, but the balance had changed. More Allied troops arrived. Japanese positions were compressed. The possibility of retaking the island was fading. In the first week of February 1943, the Japanese evacuated the remaining troops they could save. Within days, Guadalcanal was firmly in Allied hands. That was the end of the campaign. But it was not just the end of one campaign. Guadalcanal marked the point at which the United States proved it could launch an offensive, hold vital ground under repeated attack, and win an extended battle of attrition against Japan. Pearl Harbor had shown how vulnerable America could be. Midway had shown that Japan could be checked. Guadalcanal showed that Japan could be pushed back. The campaign was costly. The Americans lost heavily in ships, men, and health. The Japanese lost even more, including irreplaceable strength, time, and strategic initiative. That is why Guadalcanal matters. It was not a clean victory. It was not a quick victory. It was not a cinematic sprint from landing to triumph. It was a grinding, punishing, 6-month campaign. And precisely because it was so hard, it changed the war.